everyone. We are going to begin this session with a minute of silence to anchor ourselves in the space of this present moment. We invite you to join us. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to CSML Speaker Series. This is Leila Naderi, Director of Partnership Development at Alliant International University. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I hope each and every one of you and your loved ones are safe, well, and healthy. Leadership behaviors play a critical role in the success or failure of societies and organizations. As today's businesses are increasingly complex, it makes sense that leadership evolve as well. We call the new style laddership, a form of leadership that considers wealth beyond money, focuses on the edge more than the center, and makes shift from transactional to a relational framework. Before I announce the agenda, I would like to inform you that we are recording this webinar, and the webinar recording will be shared with all the registrants, so please feel free to share with your network. You can also submit your questions during the webinar. Our speaker will respond to questions towards the end of the webinar. So here is the agenda for today. In the beginning, Dr. Rachna Kumar, Dean of California School of Management and Leadership, will begin with her opening remarks and introduction to Alliant and CSML. After her introduction, I will introduce the speaker. Our speaker, we are truly honored, grateful, and I'm super excited that Nipun Mehta, founder of Service Space, has joined us for this final CSML speaker series in 2020. Of course, we will resume in 2021. So after his presentation, we will have Q&A, and we will wrap up the session with final notes. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Rachna Kumar, Dean of California School of Management and Leadership. Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Dr. Naderi, and welcome to everyone and the participants. I wanted to start with a note on what our school does. California School of Management and Leadership, CSML, as we call it in short, is the management school at Alliant. Alliant has campuses all over California, 6 campuses, We are accredited for more than 30 years, and the School of Management offers programs which are in the area of managing tech and quant fields. So the standard programs like MS in Information Systems and Technology, MBA, MS in Data Analytics are there. We have students at the doctoral level in the DBA program and the leadership program, and you can see that's how we align with leadership. And we have several certificate programs. So as you can see, we educate students and we empower them to be leaders. But leadership and being empowered to make an impact in the world require many skills and many aspects that we would like our students to have. One most important one being compassion, compassion for all around you, everyone around you. The quest to make an impact, make changes for the benefit of the society and the community around you is very inspiring. And that is what we strive for. Our students and graduates should have that compassion for the community and society. And several events that we bring to you, several of our discourse in the courses do actually focus on that. And that is why we bring inspiring speakers such as Mr. Nipun Mehta today. The message is to commit and connect with the community in everything you do. Give generously during your courses, your projects, your internships, your personal lives, as well as your corporate lives. You know, when you come to school, you don't just study, you get a degree, but you always and all the time are connecting with the society. So, giving and generosity is the message that Mr. Mehta has actually done a lot of work in. Dr. Naderi will be introducing the speaker more, but I will say one quote that really inspired me from Mr. Mehta. And that is not the quote that we have been discussing previously, which has to do with generosity. So one of his quotes, which I loved, was uh, was um, was basically one that we would give to all students and wish them success in service to life. And that is something that I would wish for every student that graduates from our school. And with that, I will pass it back to Dr. Naderi.
Thank you, Dean Kumar. And it's truly an honor to introduce our guest speaker today. I admire Nipun Mehta and service space volunteer team in many ways, not only because of what they do, because of who they are and how they make positive impacts in the world. And it's truly an honor to introduce him today. Just a little bit about Nipun. In his mid 20s, Nipun quit his job to become a full-time volunteer. And over the last 20 years, his work has reached millions, attracted more than 500,000 members, and mushroomed into numerous projects like Daily Good, Awaken Circles, and Karma Kitchen. As a matter of fact, the way I got familiar with service space over a decade ago was when I was searching for good news, on the contrary of what media is just like focusing consistently on what's wrong. And I found out Daily Good, and I have been receiving their emails on a daily basis since over 10 years ago. And that was my that's how I got to know about Service Space. Service Space is an organization run entirely by volunteers, and I'm sure Nipun in his talk will touch on some of the how it's possible. Even it's just challenging, status quo in business. Actually, this global platform is founded based on a simple principle that by changing ourselves, we can change the world. Among his many prestigious accolades, Nipun was President Obama's appointee on a council for social change, the Dalai Lama's recognized person as an unsung hero of compassion, and Germany's own magazine named him top 100 most inspiring people of 2018. Nipun's mission statement in life reads, bring smiles in the world and stillness in my heart. At this time, I would like to welcome Nipun Mehta, founder of ServeSpace.org. Thank you so much, Nipun, for joining us.
Thank you, Leela, for that kind introduction, and Dean Kumar for that remarkable presencing of how values are so critical to whatever we do. I mean, the real purpose of education is not just to fill an empty bucket of, with content, but actually to ignite a fire so that the content that comes in is animated in a very different way. So thank you both for holding that end of the spectrum. I want to share a little bit about this idea of a new kind of leadership, what we call laddership, because there was no word for it. We created a word. I want to share a little bit about how it shifts us and invites us to shift from transaction to relationship. But before I do that, let me set the context here. I'm going to share some slides. And let's see if you're able to see my screen.
Yes, we
are. Fantastic. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about flow, and I want to start with a photo that's actually mesmerized me since the first time I saw it. Maybe I want to say a year and a half ago. It was National Geographic photo runner-up photo of the year, and it was this Spanish photographer, I think a German photographer in Spain, sorry. And he was just clicking and just taking photos, click, click, click. And he didn't even realize he had gotten this photo until he went home and he saw it. And here's the photo. It's a photo of a whole bunch of different birds, starlings, a murmuration of starlings that saw that there was a parasite coming to attack them and they needed to come together. And what do? In less than 10 seconds, they come together. They were all floating individually. All of a sudden, they're like, oh, we need to do something. They come together, create this giant shape of a bird. And this is a bird made of thousands of smaller birds. And then the parasite goes away, and these guys just immediately dissolve. And that as a metaphor of how there is a collective intelligence, how we can tap into it, and how things are so fluid when we do that is, I think, a really remarkable place to start from. Like if we start with that idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not just what you do and what I do and coming together, 1 and 1 is 2, is that the whole, the way in which we come together, that hydrogen and oxygen are not liquids. And yet when they come together in a certain way, it creates a whole new property, which is water. And so similarly, how can we lead in a way that allows for that kind of possibility of the whole? And that to me is an interesting question. And embedded in it is this idea that genius is something that we all need, is not static. It's a flowing resource. We always say that, oh, such and such person is genius or this idea is genius. It's actually, we don't know where that starts and we don't know where it stops. And so if we start to treat it as a flowing resource, things look very different. But this, of course, is not how the world is organized these days. Frederick Laloux he studies organizations, and he has this is a kind of an oversimplification of what he shares, but I think it's helpful nonetheless. He says we used to organize as wolf packs, right? You come together and you react to anything. I mean, like sort of like gangs when they do, it's like I'm angry, you're angry, we both pull out our guns and we start reacting. And that's a form of organizing. We got a little smarter with armies as time went on, which was command and control, very top down, super disciplined. And that was another way of organizing. Over time, we realized the weaknesses of it because there was so much genius was just coerced or rather suppressed. And so we started to operate more like interchangeable parts. Most modern day corporations are like this, that you do a role, and if you don't stick with the program, I just go and change you with somebody else. And again, over time, we started to realize the weakness, and we are realizing the weakness now, that everyone is, you can't just take, people aren't just have neat boundaries where you just take somebody out. If you just fire a security guard and put a new security guard with that old one, you lose all the relationships. Um, so now we have a lot more sort of more awakened, if you want to call it, organizations and enterprises that lead with values, and it's more family driven, right? The word that's commonly used in the industry is purpose. So purpose driven, but still there's a way to go much deeper. And the next stage of that is a living system. Right? And so if you look at this whole spectrum, the kind of leadership you need in the wolf model or the army model or the corporation model or even purpose model is very different than leading an alive system of many parts interacting with many parts. And we think of that kind of leadership as laddership because it's very, very different than what you might use in a traditional sort of, I have a vision and this is my 5-year plan, I'm going to make it happen. Laddership looks entirely different. But the core sort of turning point, and there is a turning point between leadership and laddership, between these different styles of not just of leading, but of how you see the world, right? Is the world static where you can just take people in and out, or is everything alive? And if everything is alive and connected, how do we respond from that place? And then, of course, the question of how do we make sure we lead so we're not curtailing that potential? And I think the key sort of bifurcation point, right? The key intersection there is this between transaction, which is very direct reciprocity. I do something for you, what are you doing back for me? Tit for tat, quid pro quo. Right? And it's rooted in the idea of accumulation. You transact for personal benefit and you accumulate that benefit. And people who accumulate a lot, we call them heroes, we call them successful. This is the current sort of worldview. What that compromises is relationships, right? And relationships, here you see a photo of a bunch of kids that are sitting in a circle, but this is not direct reciprocity. This is indirect reciprocity. So the kid, you are giving a back rub to the kid in front of you. The kid in front of you is giving it to the kid in front of them. No one is doing it for each other, you notice. And yet everyone is taken care of. Right? So how do we start to, now you may end up giving a great shoulder rub and you may not get a great one in return. And that's the cost of being in a relationship. But the benefit is that we have the circle. We have this whole, which is greater than the parts. We have access to that kind of intelligence. And so to create that, right, to lead with that relationship, the real big resource that we need is generosity. We need to release direct reciprocity with the heart of generosity so we can cultivate a relational framework for creating a circle of indirect reciprocity. Adam Grant, some of you might have heard of him, the youngest tenured professor at Wharton, a really good friend of mine, and just a great human being. Adam has, whenever you speak about generosity in a business context or a company context, there's always this fear that like, don't nice guys finish last, right? And this was a fear Adam had too. So Adam went out and studied it, and it turns out that they don't all finish last, right? Some of them do, but some of the bad guys finish last too. So it was independent of it, and he actually did systematic research, and he had a very nice framework. He says, in any given ecology, you have 3 kinds of people. I would say 3 kinds of mindsets, but he says people. There are the givers, or rather, on one side there are the takers who just take. Right, me first, maximize my self-interest. There are the givers on the other end who give first, and then there are the matchers in between. People who say, look, I will give to you if you're a giver, and if you're going to be a taker, I'm going to put a boundary. Right? So he says in any given ecology, you have givers, takers, and matchers. And as in that ecology, if you start to really plot, and he has very systematic research on this, if you start to plot like the effect of givers in any ecology, you realize that givers are way more motivated than takers or matchers, right? Givers are great at connecting because everyone wants to be related to a giver, especially this idea of a dormant tie, right? We all have all these Facebook friendships and Twitter followers and LinkedIn connections, and we can't keep up with all of them. But maybe 5 years later, if you hear from them, if that person is a giver, you're much more likely, and research shows this, to actually reactivate that relationship. So they're better at that kind of connection as well. They're better on teams, right? Because who wants to be around people who are just bossy and pushing their way around all the time? And they actually they have a lot more influence in an ecosystem as well. But to put it in the context of flow, what I was talking about earlier with the birds, what I would say, how I would frame it, is that if you have if the center of gravity of a group of people is on the side of givers, has more givers, then you start to create this flow. You start to create this intelligence of the whole, which is greater than the sum of the parts. And that allows you to tap into this collective genius. And that genius, everyone wants that genius. Everyone spends billions and billions of dollars to create that genius. How do we do it? I think it's embedded in this idea of having a giver ecology, which below it requires a shift from transaction to relationship. So this is not how the world is. Reid Hoffman, this is way before. This is, I think, from 2013. This quote that I'm about to share has had this really money quote. And he said that, look, social networks do best when they tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Facebook is ego, Zynga, which is a video gaming company, is sloth, and LinkedIn, which is his own company, is greed. So how do you look at all this, right? You look at the world and you say, look, it's maybe the army model or the interchangeable parts model, and how do we start to move from there? How do you upgrade that design from there to a living systems model? And how do you start to ask the question that, okay, there's the 7 deadly sins. We govern for vices to curtail and contain our vices. How do you govern for amplifying virtue, right? What are the 7 viral virtues? This is not something that we frequently talk about. So in service space back in 1999, this is how we started. And I want to share sort of 4 core lessons from 4 design principles, if you want to call them that, something we have learned over the last 20 years. We started by building websites for nonprofits back in 1999. Nonprofits at the time, they didn't even know what websites were. You know, they were like, websites? But we did it. We did it just purely as a labor of love. And at that time, we weren't thinking, oh, how do we monetize it? How do we create a movement? How will this last for 20 years? We were just thinking, let's do what feels right. And what felt right was, hey, giving is its own reward. We feel grateful that we had the opportunity. But what you end up when we look back, it's a whole ecosystem of doing so many different things. You can go online and check it out. But usually you start with an impact statement. Right, I was a .com kid, right? I grew up in the Silicon Valley, in the heart of all that .com greed. And usually you start with an impact. This is the impact I want to create. Right? Here's my project plan. These are the staff that I'm going to need. And by the way, you know, if you're a purpose-driven organization, here are the values. You know, we'll sort of make sure we have those. Right? This is the usual process. For us in service space, we went the other way. Right? We started with values, and we said, okay, as soon as you engage, like you go out and do small acts of kindness, all of a sudden people are going to be gravitating. So we found that like so many people were just attracted to what we were doing. Like, you know, initially dozens, then hundreds and thousands, now hundreds of thousands. And those people, when they come together, what are they going to do? They're going to create projects, and those projects are going to have impact. So this was a completely inverted way of how we were creating value in the world. We didn't know it at the time, but we were just trying to do what felt right in our hearts. But this is what ended up happening. And this kind of impact is very significantly different than if you lead with that impact statement alone. So I would say there are four core sort of principles, right? And each one is worth diving deeper into. I'll just give you a sort of cursory view of it. But I would say it starts with this idea that everyone, if you want to lead in this sort of a way, if you sense that this flow is alive, that there is a collective wisdom there, and you want to activate it, I think the first step is you realize that everyone is good at something, right? That everyone, this quote is attributed to Einstein. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I like the quote nonetheless. It says, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing it's stupid. This is a friend of mine, Firoz, and he had, at 36, he had 5,000 people on his team that were reporting to him directly and indirectly, and storybook life. And he was at SAP, one of these giant companies, and then he had a son, and his son was autistic. And it completely turned his life around. But one of the things it taught him is this idea that everyone is good at something. So he started looking deeply into autism, and he says, okay, I know what they can't do from my lens, but what can they do uniquely that I cannot do? Right? And he started to realize that they had all these gifts, like they never get tired, they never lie, and he says, how can I start to use those gifts in the work that I do? And so he hired 5 people on the autism spectrum, and it was so incredible. Harvard did a case study on it, and the CEO of SAP says, look, I want 1% of all our staff to be on the autism spectrum. And now so many other companies have taken that pledge as well. And so this is this idea that instead of looking at the deficits, how do you look at what people can do? What are their strengths? What are their assets? And what this invites us to do is start to think about, well, what are other forms of wealth? Right? We know about financial wealth, and clearly that has a lot of merit in the world. It's able to do a lot, but there's also so many other forms of wealth. And these other forms of wealth operate in a very different way, are exchanged in a very different way, have impact in a very different way. And so how do we start to tune in to what is attention capital or time capital or compassion capital or nature capital? We had an event that we were a part of, and we said, look, we'll be a part of it. We'll support it. It was just like a traditional event, pre-pandemic days, right? 800 people signed up for it. And you usually have tickets, and you say, we'll accept Visa, MasterCard, Discover, all that, right? But we said, we added a twist to it. We said, we will also accept community wealth. We will also accept, so if you volunteer for a nonprofit and tell us a story, we'll accept that as a form of payment. We'll accept kindness wealth, do 5 acts of kindness for the community and tell us those stories. Creativity wealth, make a selfie around the theme of the conference, and that will count. Silence, spend 8 hours in silence and write a reflection on it. And so all of a sudden, can you imagine? Like we had 500 that were paid and 300 that were alternate forms of capital. Can you imagine the kind of ambiance that creates? This is incredibly powerful. And we got Obama to say, agree on this too, that, hey, this is back when he was president, that, hey, we should remember the capital is not just financial. It's also social, informational, experiential, and a whole lot more. So from there, the second big step is that it's not just that everyone is good at something, but everyone can be great at giving. People all actually want to contribute, right? They want to share their gifts. Because in giving, you are related, and everyone wants to be related. They want to belong. And so how do you lead with that? Right? Martin Luther King Jr. said everyone can be great because everyone can serve. This is a friend of mine who actually had no legs, and he lived in one of the poorest parts of a city in India where I'm from, but he had a very big heart. He's an incredible human being, and he at one point um, he would always connect with other people because he didn't have legs and he walked with his hands. He would always people, no one was threatened by him, and everyone would come and tell him a lot of their stories of how they were suffering, particularly women who were abused. And so he says, I want to do something for them. What can I do? And he started growing these tulsi. We call them tulsi in India. These are holy basil plants, and they're very in the Indian context. They're very well respected, and you tend to them. And so he would grow these tulsi plants, and he would offer it to these women. And the next time he goes by, he'll say, "Hey, how's your plant doing?" You know, and he would go there and they would chant together and they would do their prayers. But underneath it, it was this connection that he was creating just because of this plant, right? That he had grown. And he had very little, and yet he was giving from that because giving was important. And in return, all these people started to feel so deeply connected to him. They would also take care of him. And and in a span of 2 years, just 2 years, he gave out more than 1,500 tulsi plants. Right? It was just incredible. It's just an incredible story. But it stems with this idea that, look, no matter what context you're in, our hearts are longing to give. And we don't design for that, but we can. And then the third big element is that once we start giving, once those gifts start to get liberated, right? Everyone is giving in their own ways, even small ways. There's no such thing as small or big, but you might be doing your little bit in that flock of birds, right? And as you give and that giving gets connected, a very different ecosystem starts to emerge. And this is, we call it the gift ecology, but this is really an ecosystem of people with much deeper bonds than normal transactional bonds. Transactional bonds are I use you, you use me, and that doesn't go all that deep. And when you have so many such transactional bonds in an ecosystem, there's no feeling of community. There's no feeling of togetherness or belonging. And as a result, the ceiling for genius is really low. Here, you start to have a very different possibility. Right? Some of you might have heard of this project that we call Karma Kitchen. This is an experiment that we'd started many, many years ago now, and then we ended up doing it in 23 different countries, but it essentially was like a pop-up. Think of it as like one fine day you walk into a restaurant and you get your meal just like you would on a normal day. But today's Karma Kitchen Day, and what that means is that your check at the end of your meal reads zero. Now, it's zero not because it's free, it's zero because someone before you has paid for you, and you are then trusted to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. And most people think, oh my God, that can't work, right? And it's I mean, everyone. We started this in Berkeley, and it was the top-rated restaurant on Yelp in Berkeley for a while. And when you do this, you realize, and everyone's first question is, oh, does it work out, right? Like this is the bill at the end. It's like, are people really kind? Are people really generous? And then UC Berkeley actually 6 years in, they actually came up with a paper. They studied this and so many other experiments. And there's a seminal paper actually widely cited. So it was titled Paying More When Paying for Others. That when you actually set up a proper context where people's intrinsic motivations are ignited, you create a tremendous possibility. People pay more, but that's only tip of the iceberg, right? From our point of view, it wasn't just that we're meeting our expenses. It was actually that a whole lot more value was created underneath all of that. So to give you an example, right? This one guy comes in, he's very confused about the idea, and he says, Nipun, I want to believe it, I just don't, what should I do? I said, you should come volunteer. This was all volunteer run, by the way. So you should come volunteer, do the dishes, serve the food, all that, right? And so he comes, and he's serving, and one of the guests he's serving is equally skeptical like him. So he asked them a question. He says, so he has a meal. He loves the ambiance. You can just imagine, right? Collective ambiance in this place is like off the charts, and people are all feeling so connected. And he says, at the end, this customer looks at his check and he says, "It's zero." Okay, what does this mean? Like, you trust me to pay whatever I want? And you get this all the time. People are shocked by it, right? So this volunteer, who was himself confused about it, he's like, "Look, man, don't ask me, but yeah, I think that's how it's supposed to work." And so this guy's like, "Okay, what do you do? How much do you leave? More, less?" There's no even like, there's no suggested amount even. So we're like, "What do you do?" So he decides, he thinks about it, and he calls the waiter back, the volunteer, and he says, "Look, here's what I'm going to do. Here's 100, and you decide how much you want to give me back." Right? So he puts it back on this guy. Now this guy is like now looking and saying, "Oh my God, what do I do?" So he comes and he asks me, because I'm one of the volunteers that day. I said, "I don't know. Like, this is not in the rule book. You decide. It's your problem, right? Your table." And I was right. Even if he gave him 100 back, that's fine. Like, what would he do? Like, how much is he going to give back? And this same guy who came to me a few weeks earlier saying, "Oh, I didn't understand this," in this kind of situation, in this context, he opens up his own wallet, takes out a 20, and gives this guy 120. Right? Now the customer, you can imagine, is like, "Where have I landed? What is this place?" It is like, what is heaven come down on earth? What's going on? Uh, but you can see that the value was much more than just the 20 or the cost of the meal, right? There was something else that was greater than the sum of the parts that gets ignited, that invites people to step into that space in themselves. And you can apply this everywhere. This is one of our magazines. Richard Whitaker runs this amazing art magazine called Works and Conversations. And he decided to take off all the dollar signs off of it and no advertising. That means only offerings of gratitude. And it's incredible. It's been 8-9 years. It's still going. If you go to conversations.org, you will see it. Just really high-end, high-quality work, and yet without a price tag. This is a woman who experimented with this at her acupuncture clinic, right? What happens if you pay it forward? This is a fellow with a rickshaw in India. And he says, from now on, no meters, you pay forward. Would that work? Would that not work? It was an incredible story that went to millions of people, actually, because he was covered in all kinds of news outlets. So really, to recap the 3 points here before I get to the final point, is that I think if we intend to lead with flow, you get at this, first you start with this idea that everyone is good at something. When everyone has a gift, you realize that they not only just want to transact with those gifts, they actually want to give those gifts. It is meaningful for them to actually learn to be great at giving. And when everyone's generosity is engaged, when everyone's intrinsic motivations are engaged, a gift ecology emerges where the sum is greater, or rather the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that then leads us to the final bit, right? Which is that when an intrinsically motivated network emerges, you realize that everyone is connected to everything. And that becomes an incredible place from which to then think about living systems and to think about laddership. And we know this intuitively from network studies, right? And from the ways in which we communicate. If you have 50 people watching TV, the number of connections that are possible between the broadcaster and the consumer, between the producer and the consumer, is 50. Right? But now you take those same 50 people and give them a telephone, and they can connect in a one-to-one network. The number of connections in a one-to-one network is 1,225 with the same 50 people. And if you then upgrade them to this internet era, this many-to-many era, group-forming networks with the same 50 people, what you now get is 100 million trillion connections. That's just 50 people, right? So how do we start to realize the magnanimity of this, and how do we start to lead? Here's a different way. This is just network science, right? This is just network theory. How do we start to go from one to many to one to many? And in that sense, this is another way to think about it. Like you go from centralized to decentralized to distributed, but you cannot, in a distributed model, if you try to use centralized leadership models, you are going to curtail all the benefits of a distributed network. So how do you start to evolve how we lead in a distributed network? And that's where laddership comes in, right? Leila talked a little bit about this, right? That leadership is what we use in centralized networks, and it works. And there are many places where centralized networks are helpful. But in a distributed kind of ecosystem, you need something different, right? We call that laddership, where in leadership, you plan and execute. Here's my 5-year plan. This is how I'm going to execute. And the stronger the muscles, the greater you are. In a laddership model, it's more search and amplify, where you're looking for patterns of positive deviance and you're amplifying it. It's a fundamentally different trait. The power goes from the center to actually the edges, because because a lot of the interesting stuff is happening at the edges, the stuff that's going to be breaking new grounds. You go from the quantity of ties. You can have 5,000 Facebook friends, but how deep are those ties? So you start to go more towards the quality of ties, because you know that the quality is what determines the emergence. It's not just how many hydrogen and oxygen molecules are coming together. If they come together in a certain way, you have a very different quality. It's not just carbon atoms coming together in like some willy-nilly way, but if they come together in a certain way, you have graphite. If they come together in a very different way, you have diamonds, right? The quality of ties makes a big difference. It's not just efficiency for short-term gain. This is what everything in our world is all about, this efficiency for very short-termism. It's about resiliency, right? Very different look. And it's not about predictability and control. It's actually about emergence and trust. And this kind of a framework, and I'm just listing a few of these. We run these laddership pods for people to dive deep into this. And we've had all kinds of remarkable leaders and everyday heroes and people just initiating new projects who really want to think deeply about this. And I think there's a lot to explore there. But I will close with this idea that, if we want to get to that potential, we have to ask ourselves, who do we have to be so that I can be a part of this kind of emergence, right? If you're a bird that's like, no, I'm sticking with my program, I'm going to fly because I don't agree. I don't think that there's a parasite. Who said there's a parasite? Let me look at the data. All this. If you're going to be like that, you won't be part of this kind of collective emergence. Then the second question is, how do our relationships with each other need to be? Right? And then ultimately, what kind of leadership do we need to have so we can allow for everyone to be a part of this kind of a whole? And so I think if we can see the impossible, as they say, if we can see the invisible, because it's invisible, none of the starlings in the murmuration actually can see this shape. It was only that photographer on the outside that made this visible even to us, right? But if we can still see the invisible, we can actually do the impossible. And God only knows we need the impossible right now. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Wow, thank you so much. I like, especially when you finalize, if we can see the invisible, we can do the impossible. And I think it's a message we need actually at this time.
Yeah.
Very critical time to all of us, just like having that perspective.
Yes. And it connects very well with one topic we were discussing in the green room just before the Zoom webinar started, about the silent retreat, because in some sense you're connecting with with things and inside you or even externally, which is not visible to you yourself when you're not in that mode. So I will ask you to tell us a little bit about the power of a silent retreat.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot one can say about silence and this internal work, but I think all too often we can get busy in just doing the external work without realizing that if you change the eyes through which you are looking at the world, you actually change everything. Like that's the most potent lever is your own heart, right? And you see this even in leadership. If you want to bring it back to leadership, one of the things we talked about earlier as well is this idea of humility, that you really realize that we, when you meditate more, when you're silent more, whatever your personal practice is, you realize that you're part of this flow. And that's a real challenge to the ego, right? Because the ego wants to be the center of the show, right? You don't want to be a part of the flow, but it's actually very, very satisfying to do that. And when you do that, one of the very side effects of this, or one of the incredible side effects of this, is humility. So, for example, this is there's a great story of Arvind eye hospitals in India. I don't know if you know about it. It's the world's largest network of eye hospitals, and it's been the longest running case study in the history of Harvard. And when you go to this hospital, you have a choice whether you stay in the free line or the paid line, and you get the same quality of service. And this is scaled to millions and millions of people. The founder of it was someone that I knew is actually, in a way, I can say, not in a way, in a very real way, is family too. He was a person who, one of the things that you saw is that as his work got bigger, he got smaller. And that's not always the case. So one time he's sitting there and they have so many different hospitals and, it's like a giant operation. And one of the times in the main hospital where he used to have an office, now he had rheumatoid arthritis, so he could barely walk. And that was actually the impulse through which he was inspired to then eradicate unnecessary blindness in the world. It's a very inspiring story. But because he was walking this way, one time this new security guard in their building who was just hired looks at him and he's like, "Who's this crippled man? No, you can't go there." And he's like, "No, I need to go there." And he's like, "That's the executive wing. No, you can't go there. You go sit down and wait here." Right. And this guy, instead of saying, "Okay, look, I'm the founder of this whole thing and you're fired," right? Instead of saying that, he sits down. And because this guy was a new security guard was in such a zeal that he just refused to listen to him and refused to let him go on that side. And so he just kind of sat there and he waited. And this was pre-cell phone days. And so he just waited until his sister, who was also one of the co-founders, and he's like, "Oh, Dr. V, what are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I think it was this guy's first day. I think he's doing a great job. He's very enthusiastic." And he wouldn't believe me when I said I need to go to my office over there. And he kind of said it as a joke, right? As in, he was okay with it. So as his work got bigger, he got smaller. And I think that is another part of as your flock, as the murmuration of starlings gets bigger, you actually get smaller in a living system. As your army gets bigger, you have to get bigger in that leadership model. Here it doesn't. And for me, meditation and silence is a way for me to help me get into that space of being smaller so I can be a stronger instrument.
Very well said. The humility which makes you actually more stronger, more confident, it really comes from within, and it's humility to become smaller.
Yeah. And you're more connected. Right? Like when you are humble, and when you give more, when you practice generosity, you are connected. And if you have that connected web, you don't need to show people how much you have accumulated for your strength. Right? Your strength doesn't come from how much you have collected. Like the Native Americans would actually, back in those days, in their in their culture, it was looked down upon. They were like, "What kind of disease do you have that you're accumulating so much?" right? Like, why would you need to keep so much? Because you would always want to, start to give. And so, because in giving you are related, and those connections are actually a profound source of strength.
Wonderful. I think for some of our audience, they might not know the context exactly. I just want to highlight that we are really grateful because Nipun is joining us from a 30-day silent retreat. So he has been in one event, and this is the second event, right? Talking actually. So you're coming from that reflection, uh, on and joining us to share with the community, and that's so meaningful to us. Nipun, I know, just how much Gandhi, and his story has impacted your life, and also the way that service space was founded, actually, based on just that simple principle of, you know, if, if the best way to change the world is to change ourselves, actually. And one of Gandhi's quote is actually, everything happens to you is your teacher. So like my question is about more of your leadership journey. So what are the greatest lessons of your life? What things have happened in your life that have become the biggest lessons for you, that you have taken this journey of service, actually, to over 20 years of like being a full-time volunteer. So that's,
Yeah.
I'm curious to know.
Well, so many things. If I had to narrow it down into one, there was a teenager that came up to me once and says, "What advice would you give to your teenage self?" Which I thought was a great question. I was like, okay, yeah, what would I advise myself when I was that young? And I think the difference between me now and me then, and what I have learned through all these years, through all these different experiments, through all kinds of practices and service, ultimately, is I think that we all have an equation. Whenever you have success in life, or even if you don't have, or whatever you get in life, we all feel a certain kind of agency. Like, I did this, right? I have, I got XYZ because of my efforts. And I used to play a lot of tennis. I actually wanted to be a tennis pro, way back in my days. and so when you lose a match, what do? You don't go and pray, right? Like, you go and work harder, right? If you just say the harder you work, the better you will get the outcomes. And that's the narrative you had in your mind. And I would say at that time, there was probably this narrative in my teenage years that 90% of what happened to me was because of my effort, and 10% was things that I couldn't really control. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and things like that. And the more I have considered life, and the more I have experienced in all different arenas, in the external world and the internal world, I would say that I have flipped the positions. I would say that 10% of what I do is my effort, and 90% is stuff that I just can't take credit for. And you can call it grace, you can call it emergence, you can call it whatever name you want. But you realize that a great joy is not actually in accumulating credit, is not in feeling like my ego is wonderful. There is a far greater joy that is satisfying to a certain degree. I had that, right? Like, you pump fist and you say, "Yeah, that was an amazing shot I made on the tennis court." You're like, "Yeah, I used to do that a lot," and and there's a kind of joy to that, sure. But this joy of actually being the flute that is empty, so the winds of nature can play its song through you. Oh my goodness, that is a whole different degree of satisfaction, whole different quantum leap of 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 I don't even know what to call it. And so I would say, if there was one giant lesson that I have learned through all this, is to take my effort, to put my effort in its place. That, yes, of course, effort is critical, and you have to do it. Like, even if it's 10%, you can't lazy off and like just do 10% of your. You have to put in 110% of. Even in that 10% quota, you have to give it all, right? but you have to hold it in the larger context of grace. And for me, that's where I land after all this time.
As you mentioned, like more of being versus doing. Actually, you mentioned earlier when we were talking together, and I think that actually exemplifies that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Oh, Dean Kumar, you are muted.
Yes. I often have discussions with students and they say, well, is it in doing this kind of work that has social impact, social change, is it heart versus head? Is it the heart that is important? You need to have that intent and that passion, or is it the head? Do you need the management education? Do you need to have that degree? And how do they measure with each other? And of course, I tell them you need a little of both. But I think coming from you, I'd love to hear what you think because you've managed to do both.
Yeah, I would even add a third dimension to it, which is so all our laddership pods that I spoke about have this curriculum with these three axes. It's hands, head, and heart. Right? And it's something that Gandhi spoke about. Many people have spoken about it. But this idea that your head is clearly important, but it needs to be balanced with heart, which also needs to be balanced with hands, right? With actual tangible, grounded experiences in the domain of material existence. So how do you start to balance between all three? And if you look at education right now, it's extremely skewed towards the head. Right? Like you said, like that student is asking you, there's no even orientation of the heart, right? And because as soon as you lead from the heart, people are like, well, okay, that sounds nice. That's like a lemonade stand. How are you going to pay your bills? Right? That's the first thing that you worry about. Instead of saying that, look, they're not mutually exclusive. Like I can actually do the work of head with heart, right? And similarly, you also don't need to be ethereal up in the air, right? You can actually be grounded and do really quantifiable, meaningful, tangible service to the world, provide value to the world, whether in a commercial context or a nonprofit context or a volunteer context, while leading with heart and incorporating your head. So how do we start to really bring in all of those elements in balance? I think this is one of the greatest challenges of our times, especially for educational settings that we have right now, which are so geared just for the head alone. And the heart has its own intelligence. You know, there are actually neurons in our heart. Like there is, you know, science has showed us this. Just we have neurons in the brain. So that intelligence of the heart is something that needs to be tapped into.
Wonderfully said.
So it's about accepting actually the genius of and. It's not about just either or. So it's possible
Yes.
to have this and that without. I know we are running out of time, and I want to be mindful to your time also. Becky is joining us. I wonder if she has any question, but also I want to be mindful to the time actually. So wrapping up, Becky, do you have any question?
Yes, I do have a question.
Great.
Okay, so maybe you finalize with the final
Yes.
question, final
And-
note, okay?
And maybe Becky, you can turn on your video so I can get a visual as well.
It's turned off from them. So
Okay.
I don't have an option to have the video.
Oh, I see. Okay, go ahead. Ask your question.
Okay.
That's fine.
So my question is, I listened to a few of your videos online before this session.
Uh-huh.
And in one of the videos, you were at a kind of a coffee table talking with someone about the laddership and leadership. And something that you talked about was people that sit in the back of the room and your perspective of where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
Began talking about that, I was thinking about personally how I sit in the back of the room because I want to be able to see how people are responding to what's happening in the front of the room. But in this virtual world now, I've lost that ability to do that. So I'm just wondering from your perspective, are there kind of new ways of connecting with people since it's kind of flat in the virtual world?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And Leila, can we go a few minutes over? I'm okay with it if
Absolutely.
you're okay
I
with
think
it.
yes, we could do, and like for those that they are till like wanted to stay till 5:30, we apologize. We would love to hear from you. If you have time, please. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, Becky. Thank you. And I think it's so to share the context, what I was sharing was that leadership is often about like front of the room, relaying a vision here, having a plan, here's your strategy. But when you're in the front of the room, and a lot of you are educators, so you kind of know that you have a certain view, but the students have a different view. So you are not able to see that view. Now, if you're seated with the students, you would have some view of those in front of you, and those behind you don't have. Now, if you're in the back of the room, you really have the capacity to see how all of the different things are interconnected, how all the different, what is happening, as Becky said, in the room. But it's not just what is happening for the purpose of how effective the front of the room person is being. It's not about, it's not a sort of report card on the traditional leader. A ladder is genuinely in the back, and what they try to do is they're searching for patterns of positive deviance. And wherever they see that pattern, they go in and they create a nudge, an indirect nudge. So think of it as a domino. I do something, I create this nudge, and that like hits the tile next to it, and then the tile next to it, and a tile next to it. And because you are aware of all the relationships in the network, you start to see this incredible domino effect. And by the time that person says, oh, this amazing thing happened, and he says, this happened because this tile next to me is what made it happen, the ladder knows that it's actually a whole bunch of different causes and conditions that allowed for that to happen and manifest. So it's a very different orientation, not just the data you get, but what you do with the data. And so that's the first part. And then the second part of what you're saying is, hey, now how do we replicate that in a virtual context where everything is just squares, right? Or people can just turn on and off their videos, and it's like very cheap connection, right? And so what do we do? And we've actually been holding that question very, very seriously. And like I said, we created this pod technology. It's just emerged because we had tens of thousands of people. Leila's been a guest on Awaken calls, and we started to have these dialogues with all these people post-pandemic. And all these, we saw so much interest, and we said, we have to do something. People are hungry for a deeper connection. And so how in a virtual context can you create or let me put it this way, in a content-oriented world, how do you activate the context? Because content is just YouTube video, right? Content is, oh, this guy said this, these are my takeaways. And this is how a speaker speaks and says, look, at the end, let me give you the 3 takeaways. And this is how a listener listens. They're like, was this worth my time? Well, here are the 3 takeaways, right? And that's a very cheap bandwidth way to hold engagement, right? And so we now live in a content-driven world. And the question is, in the constraints of this online technology, how do you start to animate this content with a whole different context? How do you look at the fruits and say, hey, for this fruit, if we're all about the fruit and plucking the fruit and how much fruit we have gathered in our basket, that's one story, that's one conversation. But then you say, well, for this fruit, it actually needs healthy branches. For that, you need healthy trunk. For that, you need a rich root ecosystem. And you need the soil, you need the atmosphere. And so how do you connect the fruits to the roots? And that is the question that we have to be asking, not the question of how many people attended a Zoom call, right? Like that's the number of ties, right? Not the number and the quantity, but the quality. And you activate the quality by, and there are many ways. I would urge you to join one of these laddership pods. Go to laddership.org and you'll see it. But I would say that at its core, it, before even getting to an answer, it's about asking the right question. And that right question in this context is, how do we animate content with a deeper context within the constraints that we have? Even if you just hold that question in a team meeting with everybody else in your, in your ecosystem, you'll be amazed how people are hungry for that. Everyone's got Zoom fatigue, right? Everyone knows that this is just another YouTube video, right? Like, so how do you give it legs? How do you give it roots? How do you connect the branch tips to the roots? And these are the kinds of questions that I think we have to ask now. But I think we need to, more importantly, even, we need to innovate in this direction, because otherwise we're just going to cheaper and cheaper and cheaper connections.
Right.
So
Thank
thank you for
you.
that
I
question.
will.
Yeah.
I will join the pod. I'll go and take a look at it further. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Nipun, for the response. And I'm a firm believer also, like, what you said, like great leadership, or in terms of the term you use, leadership, doesn't necessarily begin with great answers. It begins with great questions. I think
Yes.
we are living in a time of asking good questions. We don't know the answers because like a shift is happening. We are there are a lot of unknown and uncertainty, but also like as you mentioned, as you know, in your presentation, when we align ourselves with that flow, then and also focusing on being more than just doing, it's just like sometimes the solution emerges, and it's just
Yeah.
like trusting that it's just like, the solution is out there. It's just like, it's not just about the effort we do, it's just like how we are being and being present to that. Nipun, I want to, be mindful to your time and finalize just with the final notes, hearing from you, and we will wrap up the session. Uh, you always, as we mentioned again and again, and I think it's a very simple principle, but I love it. I think it doesn't have to be complex to understand things. It's just, as Gandhi said, the best way to change the world is to change ourselves. So as a society, if we want to, if we could make one change, in your opinion, in your reflection, currently it's on your 20 days, what would be that change and why? So maybe you could finalize, wrap up your notes with this. And I think you love this code a lot. I've heard from you. It resonates with many of us also. I think it's a very simple principle, but also very profound.
Yeah, it is. And I think my solution to almost every problem, I read somewhere on the wall that no matter what the question, love is the answer. And these are just different ways of giving that answer. But for me, the answer has been consistently do a small act of kindness. And, there was this one big businessman from Texas that came to me and says, Nipun, I've achieved all this stuff, but now I have to think about my legacy. Tell me, what should I do with my, how should I make a difference in the world? And he wanted some ideas. And I basically told him, and we talked, and it was a longer conversation, but the sum of it, I said, you should go out and do an act of kindness, a small act of kindness. Have a daily practice of doing a small act of kindness. He said, what do you mean? I said, pay toll for the car behind you. And he had money. It doesn't need to be financial. In his case, he happened to have money, and he could afford to pay toll every time he passed a toll booth. And so he says, okay. And so like, I pay 50 cents, whatever, a dollar. Toll in California is like $6 to cross the Bay Bridge. But, at that time in Texas, in his region, it was a very small amount of money. And so he's like, okay, yeah, well, that sounds great. Nipun, you're a nice guy. That's very cute. That's great. I appreciate that. But yeah, about my question, what do you think I should do? And I said, I really think you should just do this small act of kindness. And he kept coming back. He's like, okay, yeah, that's great. But what do you think I should really do? And I'm like, really, you should do that small act. And he refused to hear that because it was too small, and kindness is seen as something that kids in kindergarten do, right? You run your lemonade stand. But what a small act of kindness does is, sure, it creates a ripple effect, and we can intellectually imagine it changes the world. but it creates another ripple effect. It's not just an external ripple effect, it creates an internal ripple effect. It changes the eyes through which you look at the world. And as soon as you start to create, you do a small act, it changes how you look at the world. You start to look at what they would call in business adjacent possibilities. When you walk in, look at it in an entrance, you just see one door. But once you open that small door, you realize there's three other doors. You realize there's a whole series of pathways that otherwise weren't open to you. You realize there's all these assets that were always there for the taking, but you were blindsided to them. So all this stuff starts to open up right in front of you. And you say, wow, how did that happen? And the practice is one small act of kindness. Do a daily act. Do it just once even. Fine. Pay for a random person or write a thank you note for the bus driver or the frontline workers, right? Or do a 21-day challenge. Do it as a group or in business settings, right? Or if you're working on a team at the end of a meeting, have everyone. We have these smile decks, each with like a unique kindness idea, and people will choose one at the end of a meeting, and then they have to do that small act. And the next time they come back into the meeting, they ask that question. Hey, how was your act of kindness? Like, and everyone does a circle of sharing, just 30 seconds, 60 seconds each. You do a circle of sharing, and everyone it's like we were like, oh my God, this is not just a coworker with whom I'm butting heads. It's a coworker who held a door for a stranger. It's a coworker that like had a conversation with a homeless man on the streets, and all of a sudden, like everything starts to change even there. So you can do these 21-day challenges. You can do these different practices in small groups you're in. But ultimately, I would say don't lose faith in the small act of kindness, because it is absolutely the only thing that will ever change the world. If the world is going to change, it's going to change because we were anchored in the small and in the heart.
Small act of kindness. And there are tons of researches and studies also, like, in terms of small act of kindness. It's just not only makes the person who does that happier, also the receiver happier, and also someone who observes that.
Yes.
Like, so it means that like it's one of the way also, even like it's just it's a totally win-win-win situation. It makes
Yeah.
you feel better, receiver feels better, and also someone who observes the small an act of kindness feels better and happier. It's just like I think sometimes find meaning in this simple actions and simple things that it's possible to do, and we don't have to wait until like we graduate, until we have that position, until we have that financial status. It's just like helps us to take one step at a time. And I think your story is just basically exemplifying that. It's just like the service space now reaching more than millions of people started with 4 volunteers, just wanted to do something, to create websites for nonprofit. And out of that openness and flow, a lot of ecosystem emerged that now it's impacting the world, and also engaging many volunteers. I have been with service-based volunteer team, just like it's just like it's amazing to see the experts, change makers are part of this system, just dedicating their time, being part of, just like a part of this practice. And that's how it works, I guess. It's just like, it's another way of looking at how we could make things work. Thank you so much for your time. Dean Kumar, do you have any final notes, comments before I wrap up the session?
Heartfelt thank you and gratitude, because in these times when we are all looking for a different meaning, it seemed like life was going pretty comfortably. We had figured out what life was for, service, social change. This pandemic has gotten to a lot of people and given them the chance to reevaluate, look within, but also look outside and say, well, how do I find what I really want to do and what is most important in life? Your talk actually connects with the ambience of today's times. And I say ambience because it is basically the unnamed search and quest that people are having the time to do. What are we here for? What do I want to do? What will help somebody else? So thank you so much for bringing that at this time and in general, any times, which is a very inspirational note.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a real joy to be here with all of you. And like I do with all life, and like I think most of you do too, we trust in emergence. We see where, things will flow. And I'm sure they'll flow in beautiful ways because we lead with the heart. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I would like also to appreciate each and every one of you who have joined CSM Speaker Series, in 2020. Specifically, we were very consistent after the pandemic. We wanted to make sure these series are going to be part of solution for the community, connect with each other, and also bringing thought leaders, change makers that makes us believe that it's, if we could see the invisible, we could do the impossible. Thank you, Nipun, for being who you are. Thank you for graciously blessing the world with your kindness, with your service, and with small act of kindness. And I really also appreciate, the entire service-based community, because as you mentioned, it's all volunteer platform, and it's just, the ripple is just coming because many people, they are involved with that. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Kumar, for always, just being an inspiration for our students, for, and for your leadership as well. So until, this was the last session in 2020. Just like, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed this conversation. It just like, it reminded me Nipun's talk really reminded me some of the things that we all are capable of doing and making an impact in a way, just like by taking one small step, one small act of kindness. So until our next session in 2021, please take care of yourself and take care of each other. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Nipun. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.